So meant to provide relief to unemployed South Africans, the social relief grant has been plagued by attempts by scammers to exploit the system. Earlier this year, 2 students exposed loopholes in the application process, and a Groundup investigation revealed further weaknesses in the system. We're going to discuss the exploitation of the SRD grant system, and for that I'm joined by SASSA spokesperson Paseka Letsatsi. Mr. Letsatsi, a good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with this, right? As you reflect on 2024, certainly for the SRD grant, a lot of revelations. I mentioned the 2 students coming from that university in the Western Cape, and now even further work that's been found here by Groundup. I mean, what do you say to what 2024 represented for transparency, certainly for SASSA?
Good afternoon, Naledi, and thanks for having me. I hope you had a very wonderful Christmas. Look, we basically agreed that there was an identification of a system vulnerability. And I think we also admit and agree that there is an identity theft. Hence, we have introduced what we basically call a FaceTime recognition, because we have people trying to change their banking details. We have people trying to change their phone numbers. We tried to make life very easy. We know that people lose cell phones. We know that people sometimes want to change from one bank to the other. So we tried as an organization to make life easy for beneficiaries or applicants. However, in the process, we found people or scammers, like you are saying, who, identified a loophole and wanted to abuse that particular system. But I think as we speak now, we have implemented measures to make sure that we block this identity theft. We also block and ensure that we protect the public purse.
Yeah, but prior to this investigation that was run by, firstly, the 2 students from Stellenbosch University and then now by Groundup, how much information did SASSA know about just how vulnerable its system is? And again, really hard to talk about this without mentioning that it was 2 first-year students that were able to pick up on these massive loopholes. Were you aware of them prior to these investigations?
We were aware, Naledi, and basically would have 17 million people applying, but obviously we do a verification process on a monthly basis. And obviously not 17 or 15 million people get approved. Majority of them are rejected by the system because of one reason or the other. And some of the reasons would be that there are people who take chances. Even if they are employed, they try to make an application. But in other instances, it's the identity theft, basically, as we speak about it now.
Yeah.
In some instances, they try to commit fraud. What we do when we identify that, we basically put that application into what we call a referred status, because we want you to come forward and be able to verify certain information. I can tell you now, Naledi, we have about 2.5 million people who are still in referred status, and they have not come forward to verify if they must get their 350 or not.
There's a lot to talk about. I mean, I don't know if you've been able to see the investigation that was run by Groundup, and as investigative journalists, they've gone to quite a bit of length explaining how a lot of the fraud does take place. And they talk about, and in fact, I'm reading a little bit from the article here, saying that first there's the obtaining of ID numbers and names which are available, because there have been, unfortunately, quite a few large leaks of South Africa's data. But then, and I'm going to read from the piece, if you'll allow me, they write, second, they open improperly verified accounts with Shoprite or Time Bank or possibly some other banks as well. I mean, have you looked into where there's a loophole there that fraudulent or fraudsters are using particular institutions like banks and supermarkets to open these accounts, and that being a massive problem for you? I mean, what's your interaction with some of those role players in that chain?
We are aware, and I'm sure, Naledi, you may have been aware that there was a breach in terms of information of people which were stolen in the past few months. But secondly, Naledi, the unfortunate part of it is that the mandate of the South African Social Security Agency is to administer the distribution of social grants. And if you come to SASSA after you have stolen an ID, and when we bounce the ID, it reflects that the ID that is given to us is correct. It is beyond our capacity to dispute that the ID is correct, because you might have stolen the ID, you might have committed fraud with the Department of Home Affairs. We do bounce the information with the Department of Home Affairs. We know that their systems obviously are watertight, but in some instances, like I'm saying, when you have committed fraud or when you have forged documents which are legitimate on the other side in terms of the ID. Unfortunately, when we bounce it and when we match the information, it will say this particular individual is actually is supposed to get the 350. And in that instance, we basically, if we identify it, refer it to our fraud management unit to make sure that they investigate, work hand in hand with Home Affairs and work with the police to make sure that we get to the bottom of the matter.
Yeah, because, and this is why, the reason why I mentioned these other parties, right, whether it be banks or supermarkets, it speaks to just how much control and power you have over what happens with applications, particularly when they start to interact with those institutions. Because part of the investigation here by Groundup, and again, if you'll allow me, Mr. Letsatsi, to read from the article, they say as part of this fraud that takes place, the fifth step would be waiting for the grant to be paid into the account that was opened in step 2. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier with some of these institutions that here we're talking about. But then they say, as far as we can tell, every month SASSA sends ID numbers of applicants to the banks, to the South African Revenue Service and the National Student Funding Scheme to check if applicants pass the means test. So at no point in that sort of interaction where you're sending ID numbers to, say, a bank, are you able to verify someone's identity?
No, we do that, Naledi, but remember what we would do in some instances when we were flexible. If people lose the cell number, we were flexible to say you can change it. So you will apply for a 350, and when the money is supposed to be made, is in fact, the easiest way of how they steal this money is to use the cashless method. They will use a cash send or e-wallet. And in that instance, a person will simply change the details and say, I want to change my phone number. I lost my number or whatever happened to my phone number. They will change the cell number in that instance. Hence, we said, if people want to change their cell numbers, we need to make sure that the person who's making those changes on the other side verify if indeed is the rightful person. I know, Naledi, I want to tell you now that we got a very serious pushback when we introduced this method of facial recognition. But we are left with no option because people identified loopholes and they want to steal the public money.
So where are we now that you've introduced this facial recognition system? Because it certainly speaks to how many fraudulent applications have gone through in the past. Have you been able to root those out, or is that money still being extracted from the system?
That is why I said we have about 2.5 million people who are in what we call referred status. We're not saying these 2.5 million have committed fraud, but we put a red flag on them to say, in your application, there may be something that we have identified which is not coming right. Please verify yourself. We know, secondly, people have complained that they don't have the smartphones and they feel that they are being disadvantaged. We are rolling out the kiosk in all our offices so that if you don't have a smartphone, you don't have to complain. Because people who commit fraud, they say they don't have smartphones. They are so clever. I don't have a smartphone, and you, SASSA, want me to use a smartphone. We are saying we're rolling out the kiosk. If you want to change the cell phone number, go to a SASSA office and do the facial recognition.
Well, we appreciate the update, and certainly we'll be watching as more upgrades hopefully will be done to the SRD grant system in the new year as well. And I think this is a great reminder to our viewers to check if your own ID document has not been used for an SRD grant application, that you possibly have not made. Important to check on that. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Paseka Letsatsi, the spokesperson for SASSA this afternoon.